They laughed at me at my own son's dinner table. My daughter-in-law rolled her eyes and said, "Someone give Grandma her pudding before she says something else embarrassing." 12 people laughed. My own son laughed. What none of them knew was that by the end of that night, every single one of them would need something from me, and I would be the one deciding who got it. My name is Pamela. I'm 73 years old. And before you decide this is just another sad old lady story, let me promise you something, it isn't. Stick with me to the end because what happened at that table changed the way my entire family looked at me forever. And I'm going to tell you every detail exactly the way it happened. But first, if you enjoy stories like this, stories about people who get underestimated and come back stronger, do me a favor and hit that like button, and subscribe if you haven't already because I've got a lot more of these to tell you. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country down in the comments. I read every single one of them, and it means more to me than you know that people all over the world take the time to sit with an old woman's story. Now, let me take you back to that evening. It was my granddaughter Sophie's birthday dinner. My son Peter and his wife Diane had rented out a private room at a steakhouse downtown. The kind of place with white tablecloths and a wine list thicker than a phone book. I remember being so happy to be invited. At my age, invitations start to feel rarer. Friends pass away. Phones stop ringing. So when Peter called and said, "Mom, we want you there. Sophie specifically asked for you," I nearly cried on the spot. I put on my good blue dress. The one Walter, my late husband, always said made me look like I'd stepped out of a magazine. I did my hair. I brought a present wrapped in gold paper, a necklace I'd chosen carefully for Sophie, who had just turned 16. I felt for the first time in a long time like I mattered to somebody. I should have known better. The moment I sat down I could feel it, that particular chill that comes when a room has already decided who you are before you've said a word. Diane greeted me with a tight smile and a "Oh, you actually made it," as if I were some elderly relative who required a small miracle just to leave the house. My grandson Ethan, 13 years old, didn't look up from his phone. And Peter, my son, the boy I raised alone for 3 years after Walter's accident, the boy I put through college on a receptionist's salary, Peter barely met my eyes. Dinner started well enough. Small talk. Compliments on Sophie's dress. But as the wine kept flowing, so did the comments. It started small. I mentioned that I'd read an article about the stock market, something I found genuinely interesting, and Diane laughed, not with me, at me, and said, "Pamela, sweetie, I don't think you need to worry about the stock market. Just worry about your blood pressure." A few people chuckled. I smiled it off. I've had 73 years of practice smiling things off. Then I dropped my fork. It clattered against the plate, nothing dramatic, the kind of thing that happens to anyone. But my other daughter-in-law, my niece Karen, who'd been drinking a bit too much champagne, leaned toward Sophie and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Someone give Grandma her pudding before she says something else embarrassing." That's when the table. I never told my family the number. I never told them I'd sold 2 years ago and quietly invested it. I never told them that the little house I lived in modestly, the same 2-bedroom home I'd had since 1988, was a choice, not a limitation. I never told them because when Walter was alive we had watched money change people we loved. We had watched cousins stop speaking to each other over inheritances. We agreed before he passed that if I ever had real wealth, I would keep it quiet until I understood who my family truly was underneath the noise of it. Well, that night in the parking lot I finally understood. Here's where it gets interesting, so stay with me because this is the part one know you're waiting for. 2 years before that dinner, Peter had come to me in tears. His restaurant business, the one he'd poured his savings into, was collapsing. He needed $180,000 or he was going to lose everything, including the house he and Diane lived in, which he'd used as collateral. I gave it to him. Quietly. I told him it was money Walter had left in an old investment account. Nothing more. I never asked for it back on paper. I never made him sign anything. Except I did make him sign something. One thing. A simple document drawn up by Mr. Whitfield, stating that if the loan was ever needed back, for any reason at any time, I could call it due with 90 days' notice. Peter signed it without reading it closely. Why would he? I was his mother. Mothers don't call in loans. I hadn't planned to use that clause. I want you to understand that. I had genuinely intended to let that debt simply dissolve into nothing, a gift disguised as a loan, the way it so often is between parents and children. But sitting in that parking lot, replaying the sound of my whole family laughing at me over a dropped fork, something shifted. Not cruelty. I need you to understand that too. What happened next wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. I drove home. I made myself a cup of tea. And at 8 o'clock, exactly as scheduled, I called Mr. Whitfield, my attorney of 20 years, a sharp, careful man who had handled Walter's estate and had quietly managed my affairs ever since. Pamela, he said, you sound different tonight. I feel different tonight, I told him. I'd like you to send the 90-day notice on Peter's loan. There was a pause on the line. Mr. Whitfield knew the whole history. He knew I'd never intended to call it in. Are you certain? He asked. I'm certain, I said. But I want you to also do something else. I want you to draft new paperwork. I'm setting up a proper family trust. And I want to schedule a meeting, the whole family, 1 week from now at your office. He didn't ask why. Good lawyers rarely do. He simply said, consider it done. I slept better that night than I had in months. Over the next week, I watched my phone. Nothing from Peter, nothing from Diane, nothing from the grandchildren. Not one person called to check on the elderly woman who'd left dinner early, feeling unwell. That silence told me more than any conversation could have. Then, 5 days later, the letter arrived at Peter's house. A formal notice on official letterhead, informing him that the outstanding loan of $180,000 was due in full within 90 days, or the collateral, meaning the equity in his own home, would be pursued through proper legal channels. My phone rang within the hour. Peter was frantic. Mom, what is this? Is this a mistake? Some kind of scam letter? I let him talk for a while. I let him spiral through confusion into panic into, finally, a kind of dawning horror as he realized the letterhead belonged to the same lawyer who had always handled my affairs. Mom, he said, his voice shaking, why would you do this? And I said very calmly, Peter, I'd like the whole family to come to Mr. Whitfield's office on Saturday. All of you. I have some things I need to say, and I think it's time I said them properly in one room instead of being laughed at over dinner rolls. He went quiet. He knew exactly what I was referring to. Saturday came. I want to paint this scene for you because I've replayed it in my mind more times than I can count, and I still feel a small quiet satisfaction every time I do. The conference room was too small for the tension in it. Peter sat across from me, pale, his tie slightly crooked, like he'd dressed in a hurry after a sleepless week. Diane sat beside him, her earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by something close to fear. My granddaughter Sophie sat between her parents, looking confused and, for the first time in a long while, genuinely worried about me rather than embarrassed by me. Even my niece Karen had come, uninvited but curious, hovering near the doorway like she wasn't sure whether she belonged in the room. Mr. Whitfield sat at the head of the table with a folder in front of him. He looked at me. I nodded, and he began. He explained in careful legal language the history of the loan, its terms, and the fact that I was well within my rights to call it due immediately. Diane's face went white. Peter put his head in his hands. Then Mr. Whitfield opened the second folder. He explained that I had, 2 years earlier, sold Walter's company for a sum that made Karen actually gasp out loud. He explained that I had spent the past 2 years quietly and conservatively investing that money, and that its current value now sat well above $21 million. He explained that I had, that week, established an irrevocable family trust, one designed to provide for my grandchildren's education, to support Peter and Diane if they ever truly needed it, and to ensure that no one in this family would ever have to struggle the way Walter and I struggled in our early years together. The room was absolutely silent. I watched every face change in real time. I watched Diane's mouth open and close without sound. I watched Peter look up at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a little boy, pure, uncomplicated shame. And then I spoke. Not with anger. I want you to hear that clearly because this is the part that matters most. I built that company because your father believed in me when no one else did, I said. I kept it quiet because I wanted to be loved as your mother, not as a number in a bank account. And for years that worked. But last week at a dinner I was genuinely excited to attend, I sat and listened to my own family laugh at me for dropping a fork. Not one of you called to check on me afterward. Not one. I let that sit in the room for a moment. I'm not calling in that loan to punish you, Peter, I continued. I'm calling it in because I needed you to understand, all of you, That respect isn't something you show someone only when you think they're useful to you, or only when you think they have nothing left to offer. I have spent 30 years being underestimated. I raised you alone after your father died. I built a company from nothing while people whispered that a widow shouldn't run a factory. And I have let this family treat me like a burden for the last several years because I loved you too much to make you uncomfortable. Diane was crying now. Sophie had reached over and taken my hand without anyone asking her to. The loan notice stands for now, I said, not because I need the money, God knows I don't, but because I want you to sit with what it feels like to almost lose something. I want you to understand what it might have felt like for me to sit at a table and be laughed at by the people I gave everything to. In 90 days, I will forgive the loan entirely, in writing permanently. But between now and then, I expect something from all of you. Not money. Not apologies scripted for my benefit. I expect you to actually see me. Nobody laughed that day. Nobody rolled their eyes. For the first time in years, my family looked at me, really looked at me, and I watched 73 years of being underestimated finally quietly dissolve into something like respect. The 90 days passed slower for them than they did for me, I imagine. But something remarkable happened in that time. Peter started calling every Sunday, not to ask for anything, just to talk. Diane began stopping by with coffee, sitting at my kitchen table asking me actual questions about my life, about Walter, about the company I'd built with my own 2 hands. Sophie asked if she could shadow me sometime, said she wanted to understand what it took to run a business, said she was proud to have a grandmother who'd done what I'd done. Even Karen sent a long, honest letter, apologizing for the comment at dinner, admitting she'd had too much wine and too little sense. On the 90th day, exactly as I promised, I sat in Mr. Whitfield's office and signed the paperwork for giving Peter's loan in full. But that piece of paper wasn't really the point anymore. The real gift had already been given in the 90 days before it, the gift of my family finally seeing me, not as an old woman who might embarrass them at dinner, but as someone whose whole life had been quietly extraordinary the entire time. I still live in that same modest 2-bedroom house. I still drive the same car I've had for 11 years. Money was never the point of this story, and I hope you understand that by now. The point is that it is never too late to demand to be seen for who you truly are. It is never too late to stop shrinking yourself so other people feel comfortable. And sometimes the people who laugh loudest at you are the ones who understand you the least, not because you have nothing to offer, but because they never bothered to ask. If this story meant something to you tonight, please hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd be so grateful if you did. I have so many more stories like this one to share with you. And before you go, tell me down in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? I read every single comment, and knowing that my story reached someone in another city, another country, another life entirely, that means more to a 73-year-old woman than you could possibly know. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.